Chronicles of the Grim Reaper, The Last Witness, by Griz Calderon. Mable was walking back to her dorm after an evening class, the quiet streets of her college town almost empty. The cool night air brushed against her skin, and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees was the only sound as she made her way down the dimly lit sidewalk. She was cautious, always aware of her surroundings, but she never expected the danger that lay ahead in this familiar place. As she neared the corner of a street, a man approached her, looking lost. He was dressed in a repairman's uniform, complete with a cap that obscured most of his face. He had a businesslike demeanor, the kind that didn't raise alarms. He asked her for directions, his tone polite, almost pleading. Mable hesitated, her instincts urging her to keep walking, but he seemed harmless enough, just a man needing help. She took a step closer to point him in the right direction when, in a flash, he lunged at her. His hand, covered in a cloth, pressed firmly against her nose and mouth. A sickly sweet odor filled her nostrils, the smell of chloroform. Panic surged through her, but the darkness came quickly, swallowing her consciousness before she could even struggle. Mabel's world faded into blackness. When she awoke, she was in the back of a van, the cold metal floor pressing against her cheek. Her mouth gagged, and her hands and feet bound. The van rumbled beneath her, the sound of tires crunching on the road filling her ears. She blinked rapidly, trying to piece together what had happened, how long she had been out. And then the fear hit her like a tidal wave. She remembered the man, his uniform, the cloth. She knew this wasn't going to end well. The van finally came to a stop, and she heard the door open. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside before the doors at the back of the van were thrown open. Light flooded in, momentarily blinding her. The man was there, his expression cold, lacking any emotion. He hoisted her up like she weighed nothing, slinging her over his shoulder. As they exited the van, Mabel's eyes locked on the scene around her. They were deep in the woods, the trees towering like watchful giants. The house ahead was an old, dilapidated structure, almost consumed by the overgrown foliage around it. It looked like a place where nightmares lived, its windows dark, its paint peeling, its roof sagging. The man carried her toward it, each step bringing her closer to the horror she knew awaited inside. She noticed mounds of dirt scattered across the yard, the earth uneven where the grass had started to grow over. Graves, she realized with a cold dread. Those were graves. Inside, the house was even worse. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the wooden floors creaked under the man's weight. The furniture was old, covered in dust and grime. The curtains were tattered, blocking out the moonlight. He pushed open a door, its hinges groaning in protest, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The basement. He carried her down the stairs, each step resonating through the concrete walls. The basement was like a dungeon, cold, damp, and without light except for a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was barren except for a stained mattress on the floor, a rusted sink, and a bucket in the corner. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that pooled in small, grimy puddles on the floor. The walls were concrete, rough and cracked, with strange markings and scratches etched into them. She could see where others had walked before her, the floor worn in places, the air thick with despair. He dropped her onto the mattress and left her there, tied up and helpless. After that night, days and weeks blurred together. The man didn't speak much, only coming down to bring her food or water, or to torment her in ways that left her bruised and broken. but he kept her alive. She lost track of time, her mind a fog of pain and fear. She knew there was no escape, no hope. She was just waiting for the inevitable end. One day, the routine changed. Mabel heard the front door open above, and a new set of cries echoed through the house. A woman's cries. Mabel's heart pounded as the basement door creaked open, and she heard the familiar footsteps descending the stairs. The man appeared, carrying another woman over his shoulder, bound, gagged, and blindfolded. He didn't say a word as he put her down on the cold floor and tied her to a beam near the pipes, securing her so she could not get away. Mabel watched in silence, her fear escalating. The man didn't normally take more than one victim at a time. This was different. When he finished restraining the new victim, he instructed them both to stay quiet before he walked back up the stairs. The door slammed shut behind him. Mabel listened to the sound of his footsteps above, moving across the floor. And then, silence. She didn't know what he was doing, but she feared the worst. She knew her time was running out. In the oppressive silence, Mabel whispered to the other woman. She told her everything she knew. About the man, the house, the graves outside. She gave her name, her parents' names, and every detail she could think of. She told her to be brave, to find a way to escape and bring this monster to justice. Mabel knew she wasn't getting out of this, but maybe, just maybe, the other woman could. The sound of footsteps echoed from above again. They grew louder, closer, until the basement door creaked open. The man descended the stairs, his expression cold and empty as always. He walked over to Mabel, his presence hovering over her. "Stand up," he ordered. Mabel obeyed, her body trembling. He tied her hands behind her back and led her up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was the end. The cold night air hit her face as they stepped outside. The world was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot as he led her across the yard. As they walked past the graves she'd seen weeks before, she saw a grave ahead of her, a shallow pit dug into the earth. Her breath quickened as she realized what was about to happen. Before she could even process what was happening, a sharp pain exploded in her head. The blow from the shovel knocked her into the grave, her body hitting the cold earth below. The world spun as she lay there, the darkness closing in. The man jumped into the grave with her. She felt his hands around her neck, his grip tightening as he squeezed the life out of her. She looked into his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, as he robbed her of her last breath. The world faded away, taking the pain with it. Mabel lay there lifeless, her eyes open, staring into the night. The sky, once dark, gradually brightened, and the pain that had gripped her was gone. A dark figure stood over her, not the man, but someone else. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, a scythe in one hand as he extended the other to Mabel. Mabel took his hand and stood up. Together they watched as the man checked her lifeless body, ensuring there was no pulse before climbing out of the grave. The Reaper's voice was soft, almost soothing. "The world is full of darkness and evil," he said, "but justice will come to those who bring pain to others. He will pay for what he has done, just as those before him have paid." As the Reaper spoke, the light around them dimmed, and Mabel saw them, 7 other women, the souls of the victims who had suffered at the hands of this man. They stood with her now, their presence a comfort in the cold night. The Reaper explained that when the time came, they would be there to witness his end, and the killer would feel all the pain he had inflicted on them and their families. It would not be revenge, but justice. A final act to bring peace to their souls and their loved ones. With a gentle sweep of his arm, the years slipped by like seconds, and they found themselves in the witness room, staring through the observation window, where the man would meet his end. Mable and the other women stood behind their parents, their hands resting on their shoulders, offering comfort as they watched the man being strapped into the chair. The man's smirk was gone, his confidence shattered as he looked into the faces of the women he had killed. The Reaper stood nearby, his eyes locked on the man, ready to guide his soul to a place where he would suffer for all eternity. When the switch was thrown, the man's body convulsed violently, the electricity ripping through his veins like fire. But the agony of the electric chair was only a fraction of what he felt. As the current surged, a wave of unbearable torment crashed over him. Each jolt carried with it the fear, the suffering, the utter hopelessness of every victim he had ever tormented. It wasn't just their pain he felt. He was also crushed by the sorrow and grief he had caused their families, the parents' anguish, the siblings' despair, the broken lives left in his wake. The Reaper had granted them the power to make him experience every scream, every tear, every desperate plea for mercy that had fallen on his deaf ears. He could feel the weight of their collective anguish crushing him, suffocating him with the terror and despair he had sown. The horror he had once inflicted now turned inward, devouring him from the inside out. As the man's life drained away, Mable felt a sense of peace, knowing that justice had finally been served. The Reaper stepped forward, guiding the man's soul away from the world, away from the light, and into the darkness where he belonged. Mable and the other women stood with their parents, feeling their love, their relief. The Reaper had brought them peace, had given them the chance to see justice done. As the Reaper and the man's soul disappeared, they knew they could finally rest. The end.